The morning sun cast long shadows through the towering windows of Jefferson County Courthouse, its rays highlighting the intricate woodwork of courtroom 306. Judge Michael Peterson stood before the mirror in his chambers, adjusting the crisp black robes that still felt new after 6 months on the bench. At 42, he'd achieved his lifelong dream earlier than expected, earning his appointment through a combination of dedication, legal brilliance, and an unwavering commitment to justice. His clerk, Thomas Bennett, knocked softly before entering with the day's docket. "Good morning, Your Honor. We have 23 cases today. But there's one that might interest you." Thomas, ever efficient, had already placed a yellow sticky note on the relevant file. A distinguished medical professional with multiple citations. Seems unusual given her background. Michael picked up the file, his fingers tracing the edges of the manila folder. He'd built his reputation on being thorough, fair, and wise beyond his years. The local paper had recently praised his unique approach to justice, firm when necessary but understanding when circumstances warranted compassion. It was this balance that had earned him respect from both his colleagues and the community. As he settled into his high-backed leather chair behind the bench, Michael observed the morning ritual of his courtroom. Officer Sarah Martinez, the veteran bailiff, conducted security checks with practiced precision. The court reporter, Mrs. Chen, tested her stenograph with quick, practiced fingers. The gallery slowly filled with the usual mix of lawyers, defendants, and curious observers, their hushed whispers creating a gentle backdrop to the proceedings. "All rise." Officer Martinez's voice rang out clear and strong as Michael entered the courtroom proper. The familiar words washed over him, still carrying a hint of surreal pride every time he heard them. The Honorable Judge Michael Peterson presiding. This court is now in session. The morning proceeded with its usual rhythm: traffic violations, minor disputes, and routine motions. Michael handled each case with careful attention, remembering his mentor's words. Every case is someone's most important day in court. He'd just finished advising a young man about the importance of maintaining proper vehicle registration when Thomas approached with a new file. "Your Honor, next case. Docket number 2024 TR 789. Thomas's voice carried its usual professional tone, but Michael caught the slight raise of his eyebrow, the signal they'd developed for potentially noteworthy cases. Michael opened the file, scanning the details with practiced efficiency. The defendant, a medical professional with an otherwise spotless record, had accumulated several citations in a single incident. His eyes caught on the unusual circumstances. All violations occurred on the route between her home and City General Hospital. Something about the case tugged at his memory, a faint echo he couldn't quite place. Perhaps it reminded him of someone he once knew, long ago, who had also been dedicated to medicine. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the present moment. "Send in the defendant," he instructed, straightening the papers before him. The morning light had shifted, creating a warm glow in the courtroom. As Officer Martinez moved to open the heavy wooden doors, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this ordinary Tuesday was about to become extraordinary. Little did he know, the next face he would see would transform this routine traffic hearing into a moment that would challenge everything: his objectivity, his memories, and the careful walls he'd built between his past and present. The heavy courthouse doors swung open with a gentle whoosh, and Dr. Sarah Mitchell stepped into courtroom 306. Her entrance caused a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like a change in barometric pressure before a storm. She wore deep blue surgical scrubs beneath a pristine white medical coat, her hospital ID badge catching the morning light. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, revealing elegant features that had grown more refined with age. Several attorneys paused their whispered conversations to observe her. It wasn't every day that a clearly distinguished medical professional appeared in traffic court. Sarah's presence commanded attention not through demand, but through quiet dignity. Her shoulders were straight, her chin lifted just enough to convey confidence without arrogance. Docket number 2024 TR 789. The clerk announced, his voice echoing slightly in the now hushed courtroom. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Your Honor. Judge Peterson remained focused on the documents before him, a habit developed over months of maintaining efficient proceedings. He made notes in his characteristic precise handwriting, unaware that his world was about to shift on its axis. Sarah approached the podium with measured steps, her comfortable medical shoes making no sound on the polished floor. The morning sunlight streaming through the high windows created a natural spotlight, highlighting the silver threads that had begun to appear in her dark hair, earned through years of overnight surgeries and emergency procedures. A young intern from City General, who had come to support her mentor, watched from the gallery with obvious admiration. She'd heard stories about Dr. Mitchell's legendary focus during 12-hour surgeries, her steady hands saving countless lives. Now she witnessed another side of the renowned surgeon, poised and composed, even as a defendant. "Good morning, Your Honor," Sarah spoke, her voice carrying the same warmth and clarity it had possessed 15 years ago, though now layered with the confidence that came from years of making life-and-death decisions in operating rooms. The familiar cadence of those 3 words caused Judge Peterson's pen to pause mid-stroke. Something in her voice triggered a cascade of memories he had carefully filed away. Laughter in a college library, shared dreams over coffee, gentle arguments about whose career would take them further from their small hometown. In the brief moment before he looked up, Sarah took in the judicial bench, her eyes catching on the new nameplate. She had known, of course, had seen his appointment in the papers 6 months ago. The medical community was small, the legal community smaller, and news traveled fast. She had even considered requesting a different court date, but her professional ethics wouldn't allow her to delay justice over personal history. The gallery witnessed what appeared to be a routine moment in court, a judge preparing to address a defendant. But Officer Martinez, who had spent 20 years reading the subtle dynamics of her courtroom, noticed the almost imperceptible straightening of the judge's shoulders, the slight pause in his usual rhythm. When Judge Peterson finally raised his eyes from the papers, time seemed to suspend itself. The sunlight that had been gradually filling the courtroom reached its full morning brightness, illuminating 2 people who had once known each other better than anyone else in the world, now separated by a bench, 15 years, and the formal titles of Your Honor and Doctor. In that frozen moment, before either spoke, the weight of their shared history and divergent paths hung in the air like dust motes in the sunbeam. Visible, undeniable, yet impossible to grasp. The moment their eyes met, 15 years collapsed into a heartbeat. Judge Michael Peterson's carefully maintained judicial composure wavered for just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable to anyone except the woman standing before him. His fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his pen, the only outward sign of the emotional tsunami crashing through his memories. Sarah's expression remained professionally neutral, though the subtle lift of her eyebrows spoke volumes to the man who had once known every nuance of her facial expressions. The same eyebrow raise that used to accompany her saying, "Really, Michael?" during their playful debates in law school study groups, where she would take breaks from her medical textbooks to help him prepare for mock trials. The courtroom continued its usual business, oblivious to the silent exchange unfolding between the 2 professionals. Thomas, the clerk, shuffled papers with practiced efficiency, though he noticed the judge's slight hesitation, so unlike his usual crisp pace. Mrs. Chen's fingers hovered over her stenograph, waiting for words that seemed suspended in the morning air. Michael's mind raced through a kaleidoscope of memories. Their first meeting at a campus coffee shop, where she'd been surrounded by anatomy flashcards. Their small apartment with its mismatched furniture and big dreams. The quiet Sunday mornings when they'd planned their futures, never imagining they'd intersect like this, in his courtroom, with such different titles before their names. Sarah stood perfectly still, her medical training kicking in. The same steadiness she maintained during complex procedures, now helping her weather this unexpected emotional surgery. Her hand rested lightly on the podium, her silver wedding ring from her current marriage catching the light, a detail that didn't escape Michael's notice. He glanced instinctively at his own left hand, now adorned with the simple band from his second marriage to Rebecca. The gallery behind Sarah rustled with quiet movement, someone coughing, a paper being folded. Everyday sounds that seemed strangely amplified in the charged atmosphere. Officer Martinez observed the subtle tension with the expertise of someone who had witnessed thousands of courtroom dramas, though even she couldn't quite decode the complex undercurrents flowing between the judge and the defendant. "Dr. Mitchell," Michael finally spoke, his voice carrying the perfect blend of professional authority and courteous acknowledgement. Years of legal training helped him maintain his composure, though speaking her married name, the name she'd chosen after their divorce, felt strange on his tongue. "Your Honor," Sarah replied, matching his tone with the precision of a surgical instrument. Her voice held steady, though her grip on the podium tightened slightly. The young intern in the gallery noticed her mentor's usual confident stance, unaware that beneath the surface, Sarah was drawing on the same strength she used during her most challenging surgeries. In that moment, as they faced each other across the courtroom, both recognized how their paths had led them exactly where they were meant to be, even if it meant meeting again like this. The success and respect they had each achieved was evident. Her in her crisp medical coat with its embroidered credentials, him in his judicial robes, and the quiet authority they represented. The sunlight continued its journey across the courtroom floor, indifferent to the complex human drama it illuminated. For everyone else present, it was simply another morning in traffic court. But for Judge Peterson and Dr. Mitchell, it was a moment where past and present collided, where personal history and professional duty would need to find a delicate balance in the next few minutes. Judge Peterson cleared his throat softly, centering himself in the present moment. "Dr. Mitchell, you're here regarding multiple traffic citations from the evening of March 15th. The report indicates you passed through 3 red lights on Cedar Avenue between 11:42 and 11:47 p.m. Would you care to explain the circumstances?" Sarah straightened, switching seamlessly into the same precise tone she used while presenting at medical conferences. "Yes, Your Honor. I was responding to an emergency call from City General Hospital. A 10-year-old patient, Jamie Wilson, had been admitted with acute cardiac complications following a routine procedure earlier that day." The courtroom listened intently as she continued, her voice carrying the weight of that crucial night. "I received the call at 11:39 p.m. Jamie's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and I knew every minute could mean the difference between." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Between different outcomes." Michael watched her testimony with practiced judicial neutrality, though his mind flickered back to their past. How many nights had he watched her study case files of heart conditions, practicing surgical techniques until her hands cramped? Her dedication to saving lives had been one of the qualities that had first drawn him to her. "The hospital records confirm your emergency call in time," he noted, reviewing the documents before him. "And the patient's outcome." He asked this not just as a judge gathering facts, but as someone who remembered how deeply she invested herself in every case. A small smile softened Sarah's professional demeanor. "Jamie was discharged last week. He's back to arguing with his sister about video games and complaining about homework." Several people in the gallery smiled, the tension in the courtroom lifting slightly. Thomas approached the bench with additional hospital documentation, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. The papers confirmed Dr. Mitchell's status as the head of pediatric cardiac surgery and her outstanding record of emergency responses. Michael accepted the documents, remembering how Sarah used to joke that she could navigate hospital corridors blindfolded. "Dr. Mitchell," Michael continued, maintaining the formal address that felt both necessary and strange. "While the court understands the urgency of medical emergencies, we must also consider public safety. Were there alternative routes available that night?" Sarah's response was immediate but measured. The construction on Maple Drive had closed the usual emergency route. Cedar Avenue was the only direct path available. She paused, then added, "I had my emergency flashers on and slowed at each intersection to ensure safety. The traffic cameras can confirm this." The young intern in the gallery leaned forward, watching her mentor handle the questioning with the same precision. she brought to the operating room. Officer Martinez, still standing by the door, nodded almost imperceptibly. She'd been on duty that night and remembered the hospital's emergency alerts. Michael found himself studying the case file more intently than usual, noting how Sarah's signature on the citation acknowledgement hadn't changed, still the same decisive strokes he remembered from anniversary cards and shared rental agreements from their past life together. The court also notes, he continued, his tone remaining professional, that this is your first traffic violation in 15 years of medical practice. The specific time frame hung in the air between them, both knowing exactly what had been happening in their lives 15 years ago. A shaft of sunlight crossed Sarah's face as she responded, "Yes, Your Honor. I've always believed that responsibility extends beyond the operating room. Tonight was an extraordinary circumstance that required an immediate response." As Sarah described the emergency procedure that had drawn her to the hospital that night, Michael found his thoughts drifting to their last evening together as a couple. They had been sitting at Lorenzo's, their favorite Italian restaurant, the same place where they'd celebrated her medical school acceptance 5 years earlier. The waiter had just brought their tiramisu, her favorite, when Sarah had quietly said, "I think we both know where this is heading." Now, 15 years later, watching her explain complex medical procedures with such expertise, he realized she'd been right. Their paths had needed to diverge for each of them to become who they were meant to be. His fingers absently touched his judge's robe, a symbol of his own journey. The patient presented with acute cardiac tamponade. Sarah continued, her professional tone drawing him back to the present. Time was critical, and every minute delayed could have led to catastrophic results. The medical terminology flowed effortlessly from her lips, reminding Michael of the countless nights she'd spent memorizing anatomy terms in their small apartment, flashcards spread across their second-hand coffee table. Thomas approached with another document, Jamie Wilson's recovery chart. Michael accepted it, noting the precise documentation of the boy's improvement. Sarah had always been meticulous with her records, a trait that had sometimes clashed with his more intuitive approach to life. Now, as a judge, he'd learned to appreciate that same attention to detail. The sunlight had shifted in the courtroom, creating a warm glow that reminded him of another morning, years ago, when they'd sat in their university's courtyard discussing their dreams. She'd spoken passionately about wanting to specialize in pediatric surgery, while he'd shared his aspirations of making a difference in the justice system. They'd been so young, so certain that love could conquer the challenges ahead. Officer Martinez shifted her position by the door, her movement catching Michael's eye. He remembered how Sarah used to say that true dedication meant sacrificing personal comfort for professional duty, a philosophy both he and Officer Martinez clearly shared. The bailiff's unwavering commitment to her post mirrored Sarah's dedication to her patients. In the gallery, the young intern watched with obvious admiration as Dr. Mitchell detailed the emergency procedure she performed. Michael recognized that look. It was the same way he had once watched Sarah study, marveling at her unwavering focus and determination. Now she had become not just the surgeon she dreamed of being, but a mentor shaping the next generation of medical professionals. The surgery lasted 4 hours, Sarah explained, her voice carrying the weight of that long night. Jamie's parents waited outside the operating room the entire time. She paused, and for a brief moment, her professional mask softened. "Sometimes I still see their faces when they learned their son would recover fully." Michael nodded, maintaining his judicial composure while inwardly appreciating how parenthood, something they'd once tentatively discussed in their shared future, had shaped her career path instead. Her natural empathy, which had once soothed his pre-exam anxieties, now comforted worried parents in hospital corridors. The courtroom remained silent, captivated by the unfolding story of a life saved. Yet beneath the professional exchange, currents of memory continued to flow. Shared dreams, divergent paths, and the bittersweet realization that sometimes letting go leads to the greatest growth. Their marriage may not have survived their ambitions, but both had flourished in their chosen fields, touching lives in ways they'd only dreamed of during those early days of shared hopes and endless possibilities. Judge Peterson straightened in his chair, aware that every eye in the courtroom was fixed on him. The weight of his position pressed against his shoulders like a physical force. He had handled hundreds of traffic cases, but none quite like this, where personal knowledge of the defendant's character ran so deep. "Dr. Mitchell," he began, his voice carrying the measured tone he'd perfected over his judicial career, "the court has carefully considered your testimony and the supporting documentation." He glanced at the hospital records spread before him, each page telling the story of a life saved through quick action. The gallery remained silent, sensing the gravity of the moment. The young intern had pulled out a small notebook, perhaps understanding she was witnessing something worth remembering. Officer Martinez maintained her vigilant stance, though her eyes reflected interest in this unusual case's resolution. "The law is clear regarding traffic violations," Michael continued, his fingers lightly touching the legal statute book beside him. "They exist to protect public safety and maintain order on our streets." He paused, remembering how Sarah had once teased him about his tendency to build dramatic tension in his mock trial presentations. Some habits never changed. Sarah stood perfectly still at the podium, her posture reflecting the same poise she maintained in the operating room. A shaft of sunlight illuminated the embroidered hospital logo on her white coat, a symbol of the oath she'd taken to save lives, an oath that sometimes required difficult decisions. However, Michael continued, "The law also recognizes that extraordinary circumstances may necessitate extraordinary actions." He picked up his pen, the same one Sarah had given him when he passed the bar exam. He kept it all these years, though she surely wouldn't recognize it now. "The court acknowledges that your actions were taken in direct response to a life-threatening emergency." Thomas approached with the final paperwork, and Michael noticed how his clerk's usually brisk movements were more measured, as if he too sensed the delicate balance being struck between justice and understanding. The sound of Mrs. Chen's stenograph keys seemed to fade into the background as Michael prepared to deliver his decision. "Taking into account your spotless driving record, the verified emergency circumstances, and the documented safety precautions you took that night, this court finds it appropriate to impose the minimum fine required by law." He made a notation on the form, his handwriting as precise as ever. "Additionally, I am ordering that these violations be recorded as an emergency response incident rather than moving violations." A subtle release of tension rippled through the courtroom. The young intern smiled, quickly hiding it behind her notebook. Officer Martinez gave an almost imperceptible nod of approval. She'd seen her share of emergency responders racing against time. "Dr. Mitchell," Michael concluded, looking directly at Sarah for the first time since beginning his ruling, "this court commends your dedication to your patients while appreciating the difficult balance between emergency response and public safety." For a moment, their eyes met, and in that brief connection was an understanding that went beyond judge and defendant. An acknowledgement of two people who had chosen different paths to serve others. Sarah's response was simple yet carried the weight of their shared history. "Thank you, Your Honor. The court's wisdom is appreciated." The formal words couldn't completely mask the gentle tone he remembered from years ago, the one she used when she truly meant something. Michael brought down his gavel, its sound echoing through the courtroom. "Next case," he called, maintaining the rhythm of justice, even as both he and Sarah knew that this case would linger in their memories far longer than any typical traffic hearing. The hospital cafeteria buzzed with its usual afternoon energy as Sarah sat at her favorite corner table, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold before her. Through the large windows, she could see the courtyard where medical students gathered between classes, their white coats bright against the green landscaping. Her phone buzzed with surgical schedules and patient updates, but for the first time in years, her mind wandered away from her medical duties. The manila envelope from the courthouse lay on the table, its official seal catching the fluorescent light. Sarah had opened it slowly, expecting to find only the standard fine documentation. Instead, something else had slipped out alongside the legal papers, a faded photograph that sent her thoughts spiraling back through time. The image showed two young people standing before the university library steps, their faces bright with promise and possibility. She remembered that day clearly. Michael had just won his first mock trial competition, and she'd aced her medical school entrance exams. They'd asked a passing student to take their picture, believing they were capturing the beginning of their shared future. Dr. Karen Chen, Sarah's newest surgical resident, approached the table with hesitation, clearly noticing her mentor's unusual distraction. "Dr. Mitchell, we're ready for the afternoon rounds." She paused, then added carefully, "The nurses mentioned you were in court this morning. Is everything all right?" Sarah smiled, appreciating the young doctor's concern. "Sometimes life has interesting ways of reminding us where we've been," she replied, carefully sliding the photograph back into the envelope. "It helps us appreciate where we are." Rising from the table, Sarah smoothed her surgical coat, a gesture she'd performed thousands of times, but today it felt different. The weight of her hospital ID badge, the prescription pad in her pocket, the pager at her hip, all symbols of the life she'd built, the path she'd chosen. As they walked toward the pediatric ward, Sarah's thoughts drifted to what Michael had become. She'd followed his career from a distance, reading about his appointments and achievements in the local paper. His commitment to justice had always been fierce, even during their late-night study sessions when he paced their small apartment, arguing hypothetical cases while she memorized cardiac terminologies. The pediatric floor greeted them with its cheerful murals and the soft beeping of monitors. Outside room 412, Sarah paused, recognizing Jamie Wilson's parents. They rushed to thank her again, their gratitude as fresh as the morning she'd emerged from surgery to tell them their son would recover. This moment right here was why she'd chosen this path. "Dr. Mitchell," Jamie called from his bed, where he was sitting up playing a video game. "Mom says I can go home tomorrow." His smile, bright and unreserved, was the kind of reward that made every sacrifice worthwhile. Later, in her office, Sarah finally read the note that had been tucked behind the photograph. Michael's handwriting hadn't changed, still the same precise strokes she remembered from their shared grocery lists and love notes. The message was simple: "You always knew your purpose. I'm glad we both found our ways to serve." She opened her desk drawer, where she kept her most precious mementos, her first stethoscope, her medical school acceptance letter, and now, this reminder of where her journey had begun. The past didn't feel like a weight anymore, but rather like a foundation. Every choice, every ending, every new beginning had led her exactly where she needed to be. The City General Hospital's annual charity gala transformed the grand ballroom of the Maxwell Hotel into a glittering celebration of medical achievement. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables adorned with white lilies, while medical professionals and community leaders mingled, sharing stories of hope and healing. Judge Michael Peterson stood near the entrance, adjusting his bow tie, a gesture that reminded him of Sarah straightening his ties before court competitions years ago. His wife Rebecca, a literature professor, had encouraged him to attend tonight, understanding somehow that he needed this closure. "Some chapters need a proper ending," she'd said while helping him choose his tuxedo. The evening's program listed Dr. Sarah Mitchell as the keynote speaker, presenting her groundbreaking research on pediatric cardiac care innovations. Michael watched from the back of the room as she took the stage, commanding attention not through force but through quiet expertise, just as she always had. "Medicine, like justice," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom, "is about serving humanity in its most crucial moments." Her eyes scanned the crowd, pausing briefly as she noticed Michael. A small smile crossed her lips before she continued, "Every heart we save creates ripples of possibility." Her presentation wove together statistics and stories, science, and compassion. She spoke about Jamie Wilson's case, though maintaining patient privacy, as an example of how quick response times could change outcomes. Michael noticed how the audience leaned forward, captivated by the same passion that had once inspired him during their late-night discussions about changing the world. After the applause faded and the crowd dispersed into smaller groups, Michael found himself by the refreshment table, holding a glass of champagne. He felt her presence before he heard her voice. "Your Honor," Sarah said warmly, accepting a glass from a passing waiter. "I'm glad you could attend." "Dr. Mitchell," he replied, matching her tone. "Remarkable presentation, though I'd expect nothing less." They moved to a quieter corner of the ballroom, where the music provided a gentle backdrop to their conversation. Time had softened the edges of their shared history, leaving only the appreciation of two lives well lived. "Rebecca's research on feminist literature is being published next month," Michael offered, speaking of his wife with evident pride. "And I hear congratulations are in order. The new cardiac wing." Sarah nodded, her smile genuine. "Yes, opening next spring. David's been incredibly supportive," she said, referring to her husband of 7 years. "He's learned more about heart surgery than any high school chemistry teacher probably needs to know." They shared a quiet laugh, acknowledging the strange symmetry of their lives. Both remarried to educators, both achieving the dreams they'd once described to each other in whispered conversations about the future. The orchestra began playing a familiar tune, "The Way We Were," and they both recognized the gentle irony. "Some things don't change," Sarah mused, looking around the ballroom. "I still hate hospital fundraisers." "And I still can't dance," Michael added, remembering their disastrous attempt at wedding dance lessons. As the evening drew to a close, they exchanged a glance that held decades of understanding. No regrets, no what-ifs, just appreciation for the paths that had led them here, successful and content in their chosen lives. "Take care, Michael," Sarah said softly, using his first name for the first time since their courtroom encounter. "You too, Sarah," he replied, watching as she rejoined her colleagues, her white medical coat exchanged for an elegant evening gown, but her purpose still radiating from within. Sometimes, they both realized, life brings people together not to rekindle the past, but to reaffirm that every ending leads to the right beginning. Their paths had diverged but led them exactly where they needed to be, serving justice and saving lives, two different ways of making the world a little better.